我懂，我是主办人，感谢和 CC，我们都在帮忙。今天是第三个 paper 需要 meet，然后今天是 David 会说，对 Great Firewall 的事，然后Shai 会说什么用 USB 偷资料的东西。
Yeah， 用 USB 偷资料，偷秘密。
偷秘密，对，没错。So welcome everyone. This is the first Papers Without meetup. As in Oscar, me, and CC, we all sort of helping organize this. The idea is essentially that we talk about papers and related things and sort of share what we know, and then we have a bit of a discussion about it. And if you want to present something, feel free to come up to one of us after, and then we can talk about it in the next meeting. So first up, we have Shai, who's going to talk about stealing secrets with USB searchers, and after that, we have David, who's going to continue talking about the Great Firewall of China. So first up, Shai is a kernel networking engineer at SUSE, where he maintains network card drivers for SUSE Linux kernel. He also likes to write web crawler data analysis automation tools in Python whenever he gets a chance to do so. So with that, welcome back.
Thank you. All right, so the paper I'm going to talk about is Thunderbolt Attack, exploring vulnerability and operating system I/O memory protection via DMM from untrusted peripherals. It's a lot to say at once, and it's complicated, and I like to refer it another way, which I'll tell you later. So Oscar already said I work for SUSE, and some of my interests beside the network card driver are distributed system and kernel internal, and which will probably show up later. So some disclaimer, I kind of regret choosing this paper because I later realized the amount of background to cover is a bit too much. So I hope this one will mostly focus on the background and talk about the attacks a bit, but hopefully it'll get you interested enough to maybe read the paper yourself. And so let's get started. So the title of the topic is like this. There's the IOMAU and DMA. And when I first see this kind of thing, it's like, what does that mean? So I think a better name or another way to call this paper is stealing secret with USB-C charger by pretending to be a network card. So you see where I'm going because I work in the SUSE as a network card driver maintainer. But more on that later, so some background first. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is computer hardware. So you might not know, but your computer is actually like a distributed system. And what do I mean by that? So when you look at your computer, you have the CPU, and you have your RAM, your memory, and you have some device. In our case, it's the network card, but it could be any device that you plug in on your computer. And one of the thing about their interaction is that the CPU is actually the only thing you can control. So you have to trust me on this. So the memory and the device, you don't control them. They're not yours. But you can speak to them through some sort of protocol, just like some like web service, we speak through HTTPS or JSON API. And the same things happen in our hardware. And I'll take some analogy from, hopefully everybody knows the Amazon Web Service, AWS. I think it's a pretty close analogy to our hardware system. So the first thing is the CPU is like the EC2. It's like the virtual machine you write your program on. You control almost everything it does there. And then you interact with something else. And something else might mean like S3, which is kind of like the more modern version of FTP. You can store a file on it and you serve file from them. It's pretty fast and cheap. And then there's maybe some other kind of data service, maybe the database or some data processing, transfer, encryption unit, and that you can use but you don't control. So it's kind of this field is pretty much how our computer hardware works nowadays. So usually what happens is that you have some data you need to encrypt, transfer, or read or write to between the surface. So you write there, you read there, but your CPU or your virtual machine doesn't have that much capacity for storing files. It might have for virtual machine maybe a couple of gigabytes, but then if it's tens of maybe like 10 times or 100 times larger, it gets pretty hard to store everything there. It gets very expensive. So that's why you will store it somewhere else, somewhere that is cheap and affordable. And in the hardware case, it's the RAM. So usually we think RAM is expensive, but in the computer hardware, it's a cheap one. And this is similar to how we store our files on AWS S3 because it's cheap. And if you look at this, you'll realize that it's a bit, CPU is sort of like a middleman. You read data here and then you store it there. Well, how about you just tell the service to write directly to your memory? And that is actually what happened in our hardware. So in modern, when I say modern, maybe in the late 20 years, the hardware produced, especially like the fast one, like the SSDs and the, let's say, the network cards that's more than 1 gigabits per second or faster, they no more go through the CPU. The newer ones, they just write directly to the memory and read directly from there. And so there you have it. That's the DMA in the title. It's another name for it. It's direct memory access. And that means your device can just totally read every single bit of your memory and also write to every single bit of it. So it might get you thinking, so what happened if the device is evil? If it can read everything and write everything, couldn't it just like screw everything up? And the answer is yes. This happens. Maybe the device is not malicious. Sometimes it just might be programming errors, or sometimes it's the driver that has the issue. But it does happen, and in our company we sometimes come across cases like this, and it's really hard to debug because something goes wrong, and it's not really your fault, and you have no idea why. You couldn't see it. It just like things gradually degrades and just kaboom. So this kind of attack, when something malicious is reading or writing directly to your memory, is called, not surprisingly, DMA attack. And DMA attack is usually, in the good old days, it's not that bad. You have something that looks like this that could perform DMA attack. So this is what you plug into your computer, and I think this is a controller anyway. They have this available on GitHub, and you can assemble itself. And if you do that and plug it in your computer or someone else, hopefully you have the permission, you can read and write to every single bit of their memory. So maybe Bitcoin private keys, or I don't know what's the same thing for Ethereum, but anyway, you can read a lot of secrets from there. And they still secret, but in the good old days, it's not really that big of a deal. And the reason I say that is because if someone can plug a device into your computer, open your case and plug into it, it's like all bets are lost. There's nothing really much there's a lot more harm they can do. If they could just open a computer, they could just maybe get your disk and just read everything from it, or maybe install keylogger, etc. So there's a lot of more even more dangerous attack than DMA attack that they could do. So in the old days, people don't really consider DMA attack, stealing secret, too much big of a deal. But so this is now we go to the modern days. So I'm not sure when this come out, but for a time, the Mac have some interface that's called Firewire. I believe Windows has it too, on some expensive machine, and they are really fast, like much faster than USB 2, I believe. So the reason that they are fast is they allow DMA. So they allow for the device plugged in direct access to your system memory, and that's the reason that they are so fast. So now things kind of change, and then there are kind of new scenarios for DMA attack, and I think the most well-known one is an attack against Thunderbolt 2. So most of you are probably familiar with this and probably have it somewhere else. And somebody showed on DEF CON, a US security conference, that they could just steal your MacBook secret. So you connect this device to Thunderbolt and just forcefully reboot the target MacBook Air, I think, and a while later you could retrieve the password in plain text. So you could just do everything you want. And this is done by the device reading the system memory through DMA. So this is quite well known, and Apple actually later fixed this, and how they fix it will be told just later. But now we have Thunderbolt 3, which in their opinion is even more dangerous than Thunderbolt 2. And the reason is that Thunderbolt 3 is really an all-in-one. So you can plug in your monitor, your projector, your charger, and you can plug in dock. It can also connect an external GPU, so you can, for example, you can play your game even on a small laptop. And again, the reason they could do so for the GPU is also DMA. And so you have a charger and maybe somehow combine with PCI Leech, the DMA sniffer, and end of story. Well, not quite. So remember how I said like Apple come up with some defense against the DMA attack? It's that in the old days, device can access the RAM directly. But now there's something that's similar to a bucket policy for S3, which is you can specify what part of the memory the device is allowed to access. So it no longer can read the whole memory. You just you can allocate some memory, give it to it, and allow it to access the device, use it. But if it tries to read or write from somewhere else, it just gets denied. And this is called the Input-Output Memory Management Unit. So IOMMU, here we have it. And this is usually integrated as part of the processor, I think. So whenever you see Intel BTD, AMD, VI, something like this, it all means IOMMU. They just have different name for it, I guess for maybe marketing reason. And with the IOMMU in place, the attack that like looking into your password is not really possible anymore. At least before this paper come out, people think that it's really hard to do that nowadays. But the paper showed that it's not the case. So despite there's IOMMU guarding your memory, there are still some kind of attack that's possible. And we'll start with the simple one. There's actually just three attack story. This is the first one. The first one is just simple. So on the older Windows version, IOMMU is not supported. So even though your device has it, it's just not used anywhere. So if Windows 10, Home Pro, Windows 8, Windows 7, there's no hope for you. Like you're just defenseless. And the second attack story is that even though that some newer operating system or more enterprisey, like the Windows 10 Enterprise, they do support IOMMU protection. It's usually not enabled by default. And the reason is that for the IOMMU to be enabled, usually the driver needs to support it. So the vendor has to update the code, and it's hard. It takes some time. So I guess that's the reason they don't enable it. And the second reason is that it comes with some performance costs. It takes longer for the device to access your memory. And I guess that's the main reason that it's not enabled. But this paper also showed the third scenario. So even though the IOMMU is enabled, it could not protect against all kinds of attack. And the reason is there's two parts to it. The first part is device authenticity. It just sums up with the PCI device tells the operating system what kind of device it is. And the operating system have no way of determining whether that's true or false. So as an attacker, you can just maybe look up some driver that has issues, or maybe it's just easier to attack and just present it to the computer and use that driver. So you sort of have control of what's going on in the OS, even though you couldn't change the code. And that's just part of the attack. And the second part is the more interesting one. So with IOMMU, you can specify what part of the memory is allowed to be accessed. But it comes, so the allowed range has a limit to how small it can be, and it's I think like 4 kilobytes. And usually the OS doesn't allocate that much to a single device. So when you're a network card, usually the operating system gives you like maybe half, it will be pretty much, and the other half will be used by some other part of the system. Maybe another network card, or maybe just user space. I'm not really sure what happens. But what happens is that your device is supposed to use this part, but it can actually see the whole range of 4 kilobytes. And with that, the device, I think, 4 kind of attack. So there's 2 attacks against Mac OS. I guess they choose Mac OS because it's supposed to be the one that's has more defense against this type of attack, so they choose it. And they demonstrate that you can read some clear text from the VPN connections that's activate on the computer when you try to plug in your malicious USB charger. And that's because the VPN interface is usually regarded as the same subsystem. So they all belong to a network subsystem. That's why there's a high possibility for them to share the same memory space. And thus, if you just wait there, and eventually there will be some clear text that you can sniff through with the VPN. But that's not that interesting, I think. What's more interesting is the second case. So it's possible to spawn a root shell on macOS through this IOMMU window. What happened is that each data packet that the network card process actually has some metadata to it, and the metadata also contain a table of the function to call for the kernel. The kernel need to call after processing the data. It's like in JavaScript you have some callback that when some fetching is complete, you call the function. The same goes for the kernel. And since the metadata is just close enough to the packet data itself, the device is actually allowed to write to that part. So in the function table for the callback, you can just write another function, which they use some spawning function that ends up creating a root shell, and then you can get access. And the last two attack is against Linux. So with Linux, the situation is kind of similar. There's one part of attack is that on Linux there's something called Unix domain socket, which is usually used to communicate between process, and that kind of communication is regarded as usually safe. But they attack using the same reading the other part of system. They found out that they could also sniff some VPN traffic that should not be read by other process. And lastly, there is something similar with the callback in the Linux kernel. That's the same thing all over again. But by changing the function being called, you can again let it call random function that you want. And that pretty much is the quick overview of the attacks. And I didn't have time to finish all the slides. So there's a few maybe not so practical mitigation for this kind of attack. The most not practical is just never plug in any device not trusted, which is not really that practical, I think. But I think maybe something more practical is to beware of innocent looking device, and if you need to use it, turn off your computer. Because if with your computer off, even though a malicious DMA attack device, maybe a charger plugged into it, it cannot read your memory because your system is not boot. So if you're in an urgent and you need to borrow USB-C charger, maybe that's something for a consideration. And with that there goes my presentation. Yep.
Question?
但是这个玩家，他有一个问题，
USB 3其他接头没有。So the question is about like how about the other kind of USB 3 connectors? So the other kind of USB connector doesn't have this issue because they don't support Thunderbolt. So Thunderbolt is the thing you're looking for. If there's Thunderbolt support, that means there's PCIe connection, which means it can access your memory. So I'll just disconnect. So if you look at mine, it's not really obvious, but there's no lightning sign on this. If you look at a Mac one, you probably will see a lightning sign like zigzag. And that's a one that has that's a more expensive one. That's the one I want to get. Unfortunately, I couldn't get one. Anyway, those are the one that has more capability and thus more dangerous. But if it's just typical, like I think anything that's not lightning sign should be safe. Yeah.
Because they don't have direct memory.
Yes, because because they don't have Thunderbolt, which is kind of like the same thing.
So I wonder a bit, because before there were these like other hardware attacks different with the Spectre and so on.
Yes.
And it's my understanding of like the way to safeguard that was essentially to say no to a lot of the performance gains that have been made
Yes.
by
Yeah.
those optimizations. So do you think it's the similar thing here with direct memory access that it's really difficult to make secure? Can you get performance and security, or do you think that's kind of very difficult to get secure?
I think it's kind of different because I would say it's similar to a degree, like maybe 50% just hand wavy fingers. But I think it's similar to a degree that it's about reading random parts of memory, and without you knowing it. But this kind of attack is guarded by IOMMU, which is another device that sits between the device and the memory. So it is supposed to be it's supposed to have a better defense against this. I think it's supposed to have better defense because it's more isolated, so it's possibly more control. But on the other hand, IOMMU actually come as part of the CPU, and the Spectre attack is also like it's related to the MMU, which is also come with the CPU. So I guess it's possible for similar attack to be seen. Maybe people are working on it, and we'll see.
Is that something you can solve with software, or because I guess pretty much it's happening on the hardware, right?
Yes. So
No other way than to build a new hardware to be able to patch it, or is there like a way to patch the AMM?
So the IOMMU should how should I say? So it's solvable in, I think it's two-part question. So with the IOMMU in place, it is supposed to solve the issue, and it's not because of some other software issue we have. So if we have IOMMU and we solve those software issue, in theory we should be protected. But if there is no IOMMU, I don't think there is a software way to prevent it. Yes.
Apple patch this if they want.
Yeah, I believe all the attack I said is now patched because the research start around 2016, and I think most of the vendor patched the issues around 2018, and the paper is released I think 2019. Yeah, so by the time I see this, it's already all the fun is already gone.
You should tell us something we can use.
I'll try next time. Yep. So I hope this gets like people interested in hardwares and hardware attacks.
Another question?
Okay.